The movie starts off with Sarah, a chef, serving delicious dishes to her customers. Having always been interested in cooking, Sarah owns her own restaurant in Little Cuba, Miami, where she spent most of her childhood. Moving forward, Sarah enthusiastically works in the kitchen with all her employees and jokes with them every once in a while. At one point, one of the chefs, Kevin, asks Sarah if she got approved for the loan she's been wanting for the restaurant. Sarah replies that she hasn't and adds that the bank just won't give any big loans. Right then, Sarah's brother Matt walks in with a bunch of ingredients needed for the kitchen. Sarah thanks him cheerily and then asks him to try her new dish. As expected, Matt loves it and compliments Sarah on her culinary skills. Sarah smiles gleefully and informs Matt that she's working on different dishes to serve at her niece, Lola's, upcoming quinceanera. Hearing this, Matt gets a little uncomfortable and asks if they can speak alone. Sarah agrees, and that's when he tells her that his wife, Dolores, has now decided to throw a huge party instead of the small backyard gathering they had originally planned. Because of this, they'd have a lot more guests coming to the event. Sarah is surprised to hear this and gets a little nervous, as she hasn't served that many people yet. The scene now cuts to a gorgeous Michelin star French restaurant where the owner, Tony Rodriguez, looks at the bunch of bills in his hands and groans in frustration. At that moment, he gets a call from his sister Maria, who informs him that she has finally decided on her daughter, Teresa's, quinceanera theme. She excitedly tells him that she wants everything there to be traditional Cuban, but with modern twists. Since Tony is going to be handling the catering at the event, he simply nods and assures his sister that he will deliver food that is perfect for the theme. Maria smiles upon hearing this and urges him to come to Miami as soon as possible for the quinceanera. She then quickly hangs up. Back in Miami, a very excited Sarah informs her family, including Dolores and Lola, that she's ready to cater the event. As expected, they all thanked her profusely for agreeing to cater a party of 150 people. Needless to say, Sarah is shocked by the number since Matt had never mentioned it. However, she manages to keep her composure and sticks to her promise. Moments later, Dolores tells Sarah that the theme for the event is Old Havana and even shows her the decorations they have chosen for it. Sarah, being of Irish descent herself, feels nervous and worries about not being able to present authentic Cuban food at the quinceanera. However, she remains silent, listening as Dolores talks about the ongoing preparations. At one point, Dolores asks Lola if all her friends are attending the party. Lola replies that they are. However, Maria's daughter, Teresa, isn't happy with the fact that both their quinceaneras are a day apart. It turns out that Dolores and Maria were best friends, but sadly, they don't talk to each other as much. As a result, Lola and Teresa, who were once close, also ended up growing apart. Moving forward, Lola goes back to her room to finish her assignment while Sarah and Dolores continue talking about the party. During their conversation, Dolores complains about Maria ditching her after her husband's business took off. She then brings up Tony, who just so happens to be Sarah's ex, following the same steps as his sister. It turns out that Tony had dumped Sarah years ago for a chef training program, and since then, Sarah hadn't been able to move on. At present, Sarah gets really uncomfortable hearing Tony's name, so Dolores instantly apologizes to her. She then reveals that Tony is finally returning to Miami after 2 years to attend Teresa's quinceanera. She further adds that he now has a girlfriend and is also a Michelin star restaurateur. Sarah is heartbroken when she hears this, but decides to stay silent. Not wanting to continue the conversation, Sarah walks out of the kitchen and into Lola's room. There, she chats with Lola for a while and then offers to buy her dream dress for the quinceanera. As expected, Lola lights up with excitement and profusely thanks Sarah. The two then hug tightly and bid each other goodnight. The next day, Tony arrives at Maria's house and greets her excitedly. The two then chat for a while, and that's when Maria mentions Lola having her quinceanera on the same weekend as Teresa. It's evident that there is a huge rift between the two former best friends. However, Tony shrugs at the news and tries to change the topic. Soon after, they enter the house and Tony excitedly greets his parents along with his niece Teresa. They all chat excitedly for some time before heading to the dining room. There, whilst having dinner, Tony's mother asks him about his girlfriend, Anna, to which he replies that they have already broken up. As expected, they all sympathize with him and quickly change the topic. Maria takes this opportunity to inform everyone that a very famous magazine named Savory South Florida will be covering Teresa's quinceanera for their next article. Hearing this, Teresa squeals in excitement and expresses how she cannot wait for the event. The next morning, Tony sits down for breakfast and tells his parents that he will be contacting Matt, his old friend, and also Sarah's brother, soon since he is in town. He then chats with them for a short while before taking his vintage car out to tour his childhood hometown. He greets all the neighbors cheerily, sips on some coffee, and then heads over to the nearby fruit market. Just as he's browsing through the variety of produce there, he bumps into Sarah. Despite the awkward meeting, Tony greets Sarah happily, and Sarah reciprocates right back. While smiling, he congratulates her on her restaurant and tells her that he's proud of her. Sarah smiles at that and congratulates him for owning a Michelin star restaurant as well. Moments later, Sarah bids Tony goodbye and starts to walk away, but he stops her, asking if they can take a walk together. Sarah tries to refuse, but after seeing his solemn face, she agrees reluctantly. Soon after, the two of them walk together through the streets of Miami while catching up on each other's lives. At one point, Tony apologizes to Sarah for dumping her so suddenly. In response, Sarah tells him that it's okay since they dated a decade ago. It turns out that Sarah and Tony had plans to open a restaurant together. However, upon getting an invitation to go to Paris for his training, Tony left her all alone with their beaten-up food truck. Heartbroken, Sarah completely cut him off and never even bothered to look at the multitudes of apology messages he had sent to her. At present, Sarah forgives Tony for dumping her and praises him for moving to Paris for his future. She then tells him about her restaurant and even asks him to visit sometime. Tony gladly agrees to do so. He then asks her about Lola's quinceañera. Sarah tells him that the planning is going pretty well and goes on to inform him that she's handling the catering for the event. That's when Tony replies that he's also handling the catering for Teresa's quinceañera. The two discuss their plans for the dishes and eventually wish each other the best of luck. They then part ways. Later that day, Sarah goes back to the restaurant and starts preparing different marinades for her dishes. Just then, Kevin arrives and notices her gloomy face. Worried, he asks her if something's wrong. Sarah replies that she ran into Tony, so all the feelings that she had buried deep in her heart have now resurfaced. Furthermore, she laments that since Teresa and Lola are going to have a lot of common guests, her food will be compared to Tony's, which just adds to the pressure. Hearing this, Kevin reassures Sarah by telling her that her food has always been the #1 hit amongst everyone in Miami. Sarah smiles at that and thanks him for the confidence boost. Back in Maria's house, Tony, Teresa, and her grandma prepare different dishes together and decide which ones will be served at the quinceañera. Just then, Tony receives a call from Matt, and the two decide to meet up at Sarah's restaurant. However, when Tony actually arrives at the place, Sarah starts to panic and doesn't know how to react. Thankfully, Kevin calms her down, so she starts preparing his order as fast as she can. Moments later, she places the order in front of him and Matt and waits for his response. As expected, Tony loves the food and compliments Sarah. He then tries to ask her out, but Sarah instantly declines. Flustered, she walks away hurriedly. That evening, Sarah, Dolores, and Lola go to Coconut Grove to finalize Lola's quinceañera dress. At that moment, Tony walks in as well. Needless to say, Sarah is surprised to see him and asks what he's doing there. Tony simply replies that he has also come to finalize Teresa's quinceañera dress. Not wanting to miss his chance, Tony starts to flirt with Sarah, telling her that he loves the ambiance and food at her restaurant. In response, Sarah simply smiles and thanks him for the compliment. He then asks her out to dinner. Just as she's about to answer, Teresa and Maria walk in, and chaos ensues. It turns out that both Teresa and Lola have finalized very similar dresses. An enraged Teresa taunts Lola for copying her, claiming that Lola has chosen the same color dress to upstage her. Lola is about to respond, but thankfully, Sarah stops her. However, Maria starts attacking Dolores, accusing her of trying to take away Teresa's thunder. The mothers quarrel with each other and refuse to select another dress for their daughters. They continuously mock each other and eventually storm out of the store. Back home, Lola decides to change her dress, not wanting any drama. A furious Dolores urges her not to, exclaiming that she doesn't need to give up her dream dress just to appease Teresa and Maria. However, Lola assures her that she's happy with her decision to choose another dress in a different color. Right at that moment, Sarah gets notified that Savory South Florida has picked Lola's quinceañera for their article as well. Both Dolores and Lola rejoice at the news, but Sarah's heart sinks deeper, realizing that everyone will now compare her food with Tony's. Moments later, Sarah texts Tony, asking if they can talk. Tony readily agrees and asks her out to dinner again. Sarah agrees, thinking that they'll discuss their menus over dinner. That evening, Sarah dresses up elegantly and meets Tony at a fancy Italian restaurant. They greet each other cheerfully before sitting down to discuss their catering plans. Just then, the owner of the restaurant, who happens to be a close friend of Tony's, approaches and joins them for a chat. After catching up for a while, the owner casually mentions that he's actually selling the restaurant. Tony is shocked by the news but remains silent. Shortly after, the owner bids them goodbye and walks away. Eventually, Tony and Sarah finish their dinner and decide to take a walk together. During the walk, Sarah reveals that the magazine is covering both quinceañeras for their article. Tony congratulates her, but Sarah just shrugs, now worried. She expresses concern that the magazine covering both events will drive Dolores and Maria over the edge. Tony, however, just asks her to relax and focus on the catering. The two then talk about their lives and even reminisce about their moments together. As expected, they get a lot closer and start to fall for each other all over again. A while later, Tony returns back home and talks to his parents about the salsa dance training sessions for Teresa's quinceañera. Just then, Maria runs into the room and informs them that Savory magazine is going to interview them tomorrow regarding the event and catering. She then explains that the magazine will judge both him and Sarah carefully since they have a long history together, and based on their food, one of them will make it to the cover of the magazine. Tony dislikes the idea and tries to speak against it, but Maria completely ignores him. Instead, she just focuses on winning in order to make Dolores jealous. In the meantime, Dolores and Sarah discuss the decorations and dishes for the interview as well. Like Maria, Dolores is also desperate to appear on the cover, so she tries to ensure that everything goes perfectly. A couple hours later, Sarah prepares to head out of her house. However, she sees Tony standing right outside. Now curious, she asks him what he's doing there, to which he replies that Matt gave him her address, so he just stopped by. Sarah smiles at that and invites him inside. The two continue talking, and at one point, Tony brings up the interview. Now frustrated, he exclaims that both Dolores and Maria are focused more on upstaging one another and less on their daughters. Sarah readily agrees to that and tries to think of a way to end this conflict. Eventually, after talking for quite a bit, Sarah asks Tony to try the dish she had just finished making. Needless to say, Tony agrees, and Sarah happily feeds it to him. As a result, the two grow closer than ever before. Wanting to enhance the flavors even more, Tony adds a few more ingredients to the dish. This causes Sarah to think back to the time when the two of them used to run their little food truck together. They start reminiscing about the dishes they wish to make and the moments they spent together while cooking. Since they hadn't cooked together in such a long time, Sarah and Tony decided to create a new fusion dish. Eventually, they end up making a ropa pie, which is a perfect blend of Cuban and Irish cuisine. They have loads of fun in the process, and the food turns out to be really delicious. The two savor the dish and compliment each other's culinary skills. Soon after, Tony invites Sarah to come dancing with him that evening. He explains that he has a salsa training session to attend and would love to have her as his partner. Despite her initial hesitation, Sarah agrees to accompany him. That night, Tony and Sarah arrive at the salsa dance training session. Sarah is instantly mesmerized by the lively surroundings there and gets ready to dance. But before that, she meets Tony's parents and happily chats with them. She then talks to Maria and her husband for quite a while. Moments later, Sarah and Tony head to the dance floor and start swaying around to the music. Tony gracefully dips Sarah towards the floor, holding her securely while she smiles up at him. The two have a lot of fun and even bond with all the other couples there. After a while of dancing, the two sit down at a table and order some drinks. Tony takes this opportunity to ask Sarah why she's still single. In response, Sarah replies that she just hasn't found the right guy. Hearing this, Tony takes her hand and asks if he can be the guy for her. Now serious, he tells her that they are perfect for each other and still are. Not knowing how to answer, Sarah just smiles up at him and doesn't reply. Eventually, Sarah and Tony walk out of the training session and head towards the neighborhood where they used to live together years ago. Whilst driving, they chat about how they used to talk to each other 24/7 and loved each other's company. During the conversation, Tony asserts that leaving her was the hardest decision of his life, but he thought it was the only way to build his career. He then tells her that he's missed every day for the last couple of years and apologizes again for how he hurt her. Sarah sighs upon hearing this and forgives him after seeing how genuine he is. Soon after, the two go to Lola's house where they witness her very poor attempt at dancing. Wanting to fix the situation, Sarah asks Tony to help Lola learn salsa. Tony readily agrees, and soon, Lola's dancing gets a lot better. A couple of minutes later, the two drive away and reach Sarah's house. Just as Sarah is about to go in, Tony grabs her and kisses her passionately. Sarah reciprocates right back. However, she quickly stops him and tells him that this isn't a good idea since she is based in Miami, and he has his restaurant in New York. Despite this, Tony tries to convince her that, this time around, they can make the relationship work. In response, Sarah just shakes her head and walks into her house. The next morning, Teresa, Maria, and Tony get ready for the interview. They arrive at a field with multiple cameras and cooking stands. Just then, Dolores, Lola, and Sarah show up as well. The interviewer and the editor greet them cheerfully and tell them their itinerary for the day. While Sarah and Tony are supposed to give an interview about their menu for the quinceañera, Teresa and Lola are supposed to have a photo shoot. Moments later, Tony and Sarah both get ready for the interview and answer all the questions diligently. They both explain their passion for cooking and their inspiration behind it. After a long while, the interview ends, and it's now time for the photo shoot. Both Teresa and Lola get dressed in gorgeous gowns and head over to the cooking stand for the shoot. They then give their best poses and enjoy themselves to the fullest. After the photo shoot, the two girls walk back to their dressing stations together. During this time, Lola musters up the courage to warm up to Teresa and compliments her dress. Teresa smiles and tells Lola that she looks gorgeous as well. Lola even apologizes to Teresa for hosting her quinceañera a day before her. Teresa, however, forgives her instantly and wishes her the best for her big day. The two then bid each other goodbye and go their separate ways. Later that day, while Sarah is cooking, Kevin excitedly walks up to her and asks her to buy the fancy Italian restaurant that's on sale. Since she's been looking for a second location, Kevin explains that the Italian restaurant would be the perfect choice for her. Sarah, however, just laughs at him and says that she'll never be able to afford such a fancy place. But eventually, after much insistence from him, she decides to give it a shot. The next morning, Sarah receives a call from Kevin, stating that the magazine has put up something shocking on their cover page. When Sarah goes to check it, she sees that Savory magazine has turned her and Tony against each other. As Sarah goes on reading, she notices that Tony has called her an amateur chef. Now enraged, Sarah decides to beat him in the competition no matter what. She also considers buying the Italian restaurant to one-up him. Back in Maria's house, Tony also looks at the magazine's cover and is shocked to see that Sarah has called him a star chef who isn't perfect in the least. Offended, he decides to win the competition to show her who's more talented. But in truth, both Sarah and Tony had only said nice things about each other. Turning them against each other was a tactic applied by the magazine to get more traction and audience. Moving forward, Dolores and Sarah work hard to prepare all the dishes for the upcoming quinceañera. While working, Sarah reveals to Dolores that she plans to buy the fancy Italian restaurant nearby. However, unlike her original plan of managing two locations, she now intends to sell her restaurant and use the proceeds to buy a new place. Just as she's about to explain more, the doorbell rings, and Sarah rushes to answer it. Upon opening the door, she finds Tony standing right in front of her. As expected, they avoid eye contact, and an awkward tension fills the air. Eventually, Tony speaks up and asks Sarah why she would say something so mean about him. In response, Sarah scoffs and asks him the same question. Both try to explain themselves, but end up in a heated argument. Thankfully, Tony calms down quickly and realizes the truth. He apologizes for assuming she said those things and concludes that the magazine probably orchestrated the stunt for publicity. Sarah also pieces together that it was all a tactic and, feeling guilty, quickly apologizes to him. Moments later, Tony asks Sarah if they can start over and get back together. Sarah, however, instantly turns him down, saying she doesn't want to be in a long-distance relationship and doesn't want to risk dating him again. Tony is heartbroken by her response and walks away in silence. Lola, who had heard Sarah and Tony's entire conversation, decides to play matchmaker and calls Teresa. She then explains the entire situation to her and suggests they hatch up a plan to get them closer. Teresa readily agrees to do so, and together, they decide to put an end to this feud. Later that day, Tony goes back to his mother and admits that he has started liking Sarah again. With a deep sigh, he tells her about Sarah's earlier response, exclaiming that Sarah isn't interested in a future with him at all. In response, Tony's mom encourages him to try to woo Sarah and even urges him to move back home, reminding him that he has always loved Miami. Tony responds that his restaurant is in New York, so he can't just leave. In the end, his mom tells him that if he really loves Sarah, he will find a way to win her back. A couple of hours later, Tony goes to his friend Ernesto's restaurant and offers to buy the place. However, it turns out that Sarah had placed a bid on the restaurant just hours before. Surprised, Tony asks about Sarah's offer. Ernesto simply replies that Sarah isn't the highest bidder, so she probably won't get the restaurant. He then adds that if Tony can match the top bidder's price, he will gladly sell the place to him. Tony understands this and decides to think about it. Shortly after, Tony visits Sarah and informs her that he also has plans to buy the restaurant. He explains that she wasn't the highest bidder, so Ernesto wasn't keen on selling it to her. But now, he's the highest bidder, so he'll probably get the place. Sarah just nods at that and asks him why he never told her about buying the restaurant. Tony replies that this was a spontaneous decision. He then asks her to partner up with him so that they both can run the place. Since he's based in New York, he asks Sarah to be in charge of the restaurant. Sarah, however, gets offended by how he has managed to plan her entire future behind her back. Fuming, she tells him she doesn't need rescuing and refuses to partner up with him. She then angrily walks away, leaving Tony frustrated. Days pass by and it's now time for Lola's quinceañera. Dolores, Matt, and Sarah work hard on the event and try to make sure that everything is perfect. But just then, Matt gets a call stating that the venue they had decided on had caught on fire, because of which they might need to reschedule. As expected, Dolores is shocked and starts panicking since all the family members have already arrived. Matt suggests they host the event in their backyard, but since they're having hundreds of people over, Dolores exclaims it's impossible. On top of that, the magazine might also be coming over any time now. With no other option left, Matt decides to reschedule the event. Sarah calls the magazine and informs them about this, while Dolores calls Lola and sadly reveals this news to her. As expected, Lola is heartbroken and doesn't know what to do. When Teresa sees this, she asks Lola what happened. Lola tells her the entire story and laments that her dreams just never come true. At that moment, Teresa gets an idea. She rushes home, tells Maria about Lola's dilemma, and then asks if they can have a double quinceañera. Since her venue is extremely large, both of them could easily have their parties there, and this way, Lola wouldn't have to reschedule. Tony readily agrees to the idea, but Maria outright refuses. She retorts, saying that the event is supposed to be about Teresa only, and no one should be stealing her limelight. Finally, after Teresa's constant insistence, Maria begrudgingly agrees. On the other hand, Dolores also refuses to hold the event at Teresa's venue. Enraged, she exclaims that they're not a charity case and are fully capable of booking another place for the quinceañera. However, Lola insists, and Matt agrees to her plan as well. He offers to give the money for the venue and decorations to Maria's family, to ensure that they won't have to receive any favors from them. Eventually, Sarah reasons that if they start looking for another venue now, they won't find one for months. Because of this, she states that it's best for both the quinceañeras to be held at the same time. Not having any other choice, Dolores reluctantly agrees. Since the events are now taking place on the same day, Sarah goes to Tony's restaurant and offers to help with the catering. She expresses that they will now have double the number of guests, so cooking for them all won't be so easy. Tony thanks Sarah for her help, and the two quickly start working. In the meantime, Dolores goes to the quinceañera venue and thanks Maria for helping her out. Maria simply replies that she did this for the girls and walks away. Soon after, the rehearsal starts and Maria informs everyone about their respective roles. She then asks Lola and Teresa if they are finished with their speeches for the event. Both the girls reply that they have and ask if they can practice it now. Maria readily agrees and asks them to take the stage. Moments later, Teresa and Lola walk over to the stage and begin their speech. Both Maria and Dolores are initially confused about what the girls are getting at, but they soon come to realize the true purpose of the speech. It turns out that the girls had devised a plan to bring their moms together and thank them both for their sacrifices. They have created a special speech for Maria and Dolores, hoping that after hearing it, their moms will forgive each other and end their conflict. Teresa and Lola talk about how much love they receive from both families and wish for that to happen again. At the end of their speech, they present a slideshow featuring moments of their families together. As Maria and Dolores watch, they become emotional and reminisce about how close they once were. Realizing their mistake, they apologize to each other and decide to end their rift, vowing to start over as best friends. They hug, and everyone at the venue cheers for them. Soon after, the rehearsal resumes, and that's when Lola asks where the interviewers are. In response, a flustered Sarah informs them that the magazine only agreed to cover the event because of the rivalry between Sarah and Tony. However, since they've reconciled and are planning to hold the events together, the magazine is no longer interested. That night, the quinceañeras begin, and both Tony and Sarah work hard to present an assortment of dishes to the guests. Eventually, Kevin joins them and suggests they retire for the night and enjoy their niece's events. Sarah and Tony thank Kevin and decide to head to the main hall. Just then, the owner of Savory South Florida, Megan, approaches them and says that they would still love to cover the event. She explains that showcasing the bonding of two families is much more enjoyable and heartwarming than covering the rivalry between two exes. Hearing this, Sarah and Tony thank Megan for her cooperation and invite her to join them. Moments later, all three of them reach the main hall just in time to see Lola and Teresa make their grand entrance. The entire audience cheers for them and congratulates them. The girls then light up the candles and thank their parents for their hard work and love. Shortly after, Maria and Dolores help their daughters remove their sneakers and put on heels, symbolizing their transition from childhood to womanhood. The girls excitedly celebrate this moment and give a heartfelt speech to the guests. At one point, they even thank Sarah and Tony for always standing by them and helping to make the event such a success. They then proceed with their dance performance. Towards the end of the event, Sarah and Tony walk over to the stage to congratulate the girls on their transition to womanhood. They reveal the cover of Savory South Florida's newest edition, featuring Lola and Teresa happily celebrating their quinceañera. As expected, everyone cheers with excitement. Later, Sarah approaches Tony and tells him that she's ready to partner with him. Tony is elated to hear this, and the two proceed with their collaboration. They then kiss passionately and decide to give their relationship another chance. Soon, months pass by, and Tony and Sarah finally open Cubish, the restaurant they've always wanted to start together. They invite their families for the grand opening and celebrate a new chapter of their lives. The movie finally ends with Tony and Sarah kissing each other, celebrating the opening of their dream restaurant.